Hello, everyone. Today I am going to go over focused coding and various second cycle coding strategies. So we're going to learn a little bit about how to conceptualize a focus code and then moving more into more abstract levels of analysis. For example, what does a category look like? What do properties and dimensions look like within a category, and how might this all fit together in a working conceptual framework slash skeleton? So remember our conversation earlier about just the bones and the importance of initial coding. Now we're going to use that initial coding, i.e. our gerunds, to be able to move up from description to abstraction. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly here. Okay, so we are looking at focus coding and second cycle analytic strategies. So this week we are going over using analytic strategies to dig into focus codes. So mainly looking at clustering our gerunds together in a focus code and then trying to dig deeper into the meaning of our focus codes, trying to come up with code definitions that not only encompass the actions of our gerunds, but also hang together nicely. So we're looking for gerunds that, like Johnny Saldana says, look alike and feel alike, and pull them together into focus codes. And we're going to learn about digging deeper into our focus codes. We are also going to look at how focus codes can be developed within memos. So one of the most important analytic strategies within grounded theory, coding strategies, is really gerunding, but also memoing from start to finish. So from your very first interview to the very final conceptualization of, let's say, your theory or your context-specific framework, the researcher should really be memoing all the way through. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're also going to talk about searching for properties within a clump of focus codes, and we are going to bring in chapter 4 of Anson Strauss and Juliet Corbin's book to be able to give us just another voice to think about data conceptualization. And then we are going to talk about developing dimensions within a property. So this is something that can be a little bit confusing. So you might want to watch this lecture a couple of times, dig into Sharmaz's reading for this week, but also dig in deep to chapter 4 of Corbin and Strauss, because they give some examples of what property development looks like and dimension development looks like. And I'm also going to give you some examples at the end of this lecture from something I'm working on right now within my own analysis with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the EBCI Family Safety Program. So what are focused codes? Last week we learned about gerunds / initial coding. So CGT analytic strategies really consist of two main phases. The first one is the initial phase, involved naming each word, line, or segment. So that is our gerund strategy. The second is a focused selective phase that uses the most significant and frequent initial codes. So remember, we're looking for frequency, we're looking for significance, to sort, synthesize, integrate, and organize large amounts of data. So we really use our focus codes to develop a code book. And then once we have our code book, coding actually becomes quite easy, or I should say easier than the initial coding strategy, because we're just moving through large amounts of data, marking our data. So for the sake of this course, we're really sticking, if we look at the diagram on the right-hand side, to level 1 coding and level 2 coding. And Kathy Sharma says in her book and lectures that you can actually just even stay there. Initial coding and focus coding give you enough to really work through a very in-depth qualitative study or grounded theory study. For more theoretical development and conceptual development, you do not have to do this for this class. You can look at axial or thematic coding level 3, and then also level 4, which involves theoretical coding. So level 3 involves, axial coding is often known as codes that really, the metaphor is like the axis of a wheel or axes of a wheel, meaning that there's different spokes that connect the external part of the wheel to the internal part. And so those are codes that are really our connector codes. So let's say we've developed a category, we want to understand how it connects to another category. That could be our axial coding. It's also defined here as the researcher looks at previous coding and studies it to develop highly refined themes. So this is like more of our end stage analysis where we are refining our codes. And lastly, level 4 coding, theoretical coding, often happens as a reaction to or a response to our theoretical sampling. So we're looking to saturate our categories and themes. These are often also known, our theoretical codes are often our storytelling codes. So things that really pull our entire theory together. So what is the large scale social process that we are aiming to explicate? But for the sake of this course, it's perfectly fine to just stay in the level 1 and level 2 coding strategies. So let's talk a little bit about how focus codes and memos can work together. And I really like this image because this is the part of our projects that actually gets very messy, creative, artistic. We're going to start drawing, we're going to start free writing, we're going to start trying to really dig deeper into our analysis to further our conceptualization of data. So coding and memos. So analytic memos are brief notes that we write to ourselves or to our research teams. They involve thoughts, ideas, and questions that come to the researcher's mind during data gathering, coding, or data analysis. So we often pose questions on our data. So chapter 4 of Corbin and Strauss's book for this week actually gives us these thinking strategies, which offer questions that we can ask of our data. And then we can respond to those questions using our data in memos. So qualitative researchers use analytic memos to write down our reflections, and we can also code our memos and use them as additional data for our research. So the reason why we are writing so many memos is that the memos often become the backbone of our manuscript. So we refine memos over time, we collapse and combine memos, and they really help us move our analysis along. So if we think about phase 1 or cycle 1 being our initial coding, phase 2 or cycle 2 being our focus coding, we can really think of phase 3 as being raising our focus codes to more higher level conceptual categories. So once we move from like clustering our initial codes to focus codes, we can then also cluster our focus codes into categories. And then from there, we're going to talk in a minute about properties and dimensions. So a category may subsume common themes and patterns in several codes. So we want to use memos to try to understand our categories by writing narrative statements in the memo that explicate the properties of a category, which I'll explain in a minute, specify the conditions under which the category arises, is maintained, and changes, and describe its consequences. And show how this category is related to other categories. So what are the linkages between this category and others? So A really good article to reference in partnership with watching this lecture is the first article that I introduced in the course, which is Dr. Mary Sue Heileman and Dr. Highberry Peters' article on Once You're 82, Cancer Has a Different Meaning, because they really dig into that article in terms of the result sections of how they use property and dimension development in their analysis. But I'm going to show you some other examples in a minute as well. So it's very important to memo and diagram throughout our grounded theory analysis. So let me give you just some tips about what to do when coming up against this idea of memo writing, which can be a little bit intimidating. So we're going to first stop coding and record a memo on your idea. So as soon as an idea arises while you're in the coding process, you should have a notebook or an open Word document and quickly just write down your ideas. Don't worry about spelling, don't worry about grammar, just get them down as fast as you can. Memos not only describe a phenomena they're about, but they move on to the meta level by being analytical, conceptual. They help the researcher step back from the material and see it at an analytical distance, because we know when we're coding, we're really micro, and then we want to step back and see it more of a big picture. Memos are really our theoretical notes about data and the conceptual connections between categories. So we could be working on a category and then see a connection to another one, and we want to write that down in a memo. We can also ask questions. For example, in our previous slide, we talk a lot about consequences. There's a lot of really great analytic exercises, which we will cover more in class next week, where we go through different grids and tables and come up with ideas like asking questions of our data using who, what, where, when, and why, and with what consequences. So we can use one concept in your data and try to really see if we can answer those questions. So there's different types of memos. In your field notes, you write down memos about methodological decisions and planning steps, case selection, and we can also take memos on our interpretive team section. So when my research team and I get together and we have a coding session, we're trying to bring together data, conceptualize data, we usually have a team member taking notes on all of our ideas related to our data analysis. The most important variant for the development of grounded theory is writing memos that contain code notes and theoretical notes. So this is true also for phenomenology and narrative analysis, case study analysis, ethnography. We need to develop codes, but code notes are often our code definitions. So we need to develop our focus codes, but then we also need to define them. And we also need theoretical notes in terms of we are starting to theorize about our data. We're starting to make hypotheses. So if this happens, then what? So in the process of data analysis, codes can be elaborated so that the code notes or code definitions can be further developed more theoretically. Although it is tempting to not write memos as a part of the analytic process. Trust me, I have been there, where I'm so exhausted after an interview that I don't really feel like I can memo. But writing memos is absolutely critical to getting your ideas down on paper. And also when we enter into the constant comparative analysis. So how did participant 1 compare to participant 3, compare to participant 5? That is usually pretty fresh after we've interviewed someone or after we've been doing a coding session. Also diagramming. We did some diagramming in class last week. We really want to make sure that we are conceptualizing our data through diagrams. And that's a very important element of the analysis and should never be considered extra. It should always be considered critical, no matter how little time the analyst has to work with their data. So writing memos should accompany the whole analytic process from start to finish. Okay, so when we are coming up with focus codes, and then we're seeing, okay, I actually want to pull these focus codes together in some sort of larger analytic category, we will then start to work the other way in terms of breaking down our category into properties and dimensions. So what are properties and what are dimensions? So I like to define properties as the characteristics or qualities that define the category. So Corbin and Strauss in chapter 4 use kind of an interesting and simple analogy as looking for oranges in a store. So you're looking across oranges in the store and you're noticing that some are cheaper than others. That's just an observation. So you're noticing that the price of them is linked to this idea of juiciness. So we've come up with this idea of there's a property of juiciness. So what we want to do is define what does it mean to be a juicy orange. So that could be extra liquid, that could be sweetness, that could be the amount of juice that comes from the orange. Sorry, I'm just trying to think of 3 properties of an orange. But then we want to think of dimensions. So dimensions happen on a range. So we can look at oranges and really sort them from dry oranges to very juicy. So sometimes this actually comes up in our data where we're like, oh, that participant is experiencing this phenomenon less so. And this participant is experiencing this phenomenon more so. And then we ask questions of our data saying, why is that? That actually gives us the key to what is the dimension here of these properties, or maybe of one property. So same thing with sweet. So sometimes we can have a property of sweet. So sweet tastes like sugar. Sweet makes our taste buds delight. Sweetness gives us sugar high. So those are just 3 properties. But then when we look at various oranges, let's say we taste a bunch of them, they can fall in a range from this is the sweetest orange to this one is sour to this one is bland. As you can see, our participants follow the same tracks as sometimes they experience things more so or less so. So what does this look like in a real data set when we go away from the grocery store and stop talking about what orange is and start talking about, okay, now I have to make sense of this data set. So I put in our weekly course content an example that I am working on. So I'm really working on a code, a name, which is really more of a category around descriptions of the relationship and connection that one feels to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So this study is done amongst child welfare workers that work in the family safety program in Cherokee, North Carolina. So on the reservation with families who are enrolled members of the Cherokee tribe, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So one of our research questions, because this is an intervention study, so we are looking at trying to understand how the relationship to EBCI and the connection one feels to the tribe and the organization impacts the work that they do with children and families who are in the child welfare system. And so what I've done here is really look at our data before and after an intervention done with child welfare workers that the tribe developed. And the intervention was to develop an onboarding program and system that lasted 8 weeks. And during that time, child welfare workers learned about the history of Cherokee culture. They learned about historical grief and culture. They learned about boarding schools. They learned about the really challenging and brutal history of child welfare workers taking babies and children away from their families and trying to re-educate them within boarding school system. So a lot of challenging and traumatic history. And the intent of that is to really deepen the connection to the history of the tribe, to really reframe child welfare workers' ideas of why there is involvement in child welfare system that is rooted in often intergenerational trauma, and how do you approach families that often are distrustful of child welfare workers. So all of that is to say there's a lot that went into this project. We're looking at many different domains, but some of our initial findings are here. And so this is all from memos. This is all from trying to define different codes that came up. I have posted this and our diagram that I'm going to show you in a minute, but I just wanted to show you that, some of this doesn't emerge chronologically. Sometimes this all emerges at once, and then you're sorting out, well, what is a property and what is a dimension? So we found that there's many, when looking at connections and relationships to EBCI, we found that one property was that people experienced geographic connections. So connections to the land, which is the Koala boundary in North Carolina, connection to leadership of the tribe. We found community engagement and family connections. So you'll notice community engagement is a code that, or a property, I should say, that we elevated. It was first a code that we elevated to a property that we actually found a range in community engagement. And this differed based on if somebody was an enrolled member of the tribe versus being a non-enrolled member. So you can see that our range fell there. And so we really highlighted that and said, oh, we found a dimension here in our data. Challenges with relationships came up as well, which we're going to add to our conceptual framework. And then ultimately, we wanted to answer the question, how do these connections and relationships impact the work? So I'm going to show you how we then moved our how we moved this kind of conceptualization, memoing, diagramming, searching for properties and dimensions into more of a context-specific framework. So the title here, or I would say the category, is relationship to Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. We found there was geographical connections to leadership, community engagement. This is where we demonstrate the range. There was these vary based on enrollment, and then family connections. Challenges with relationships, we also found a dimension. So I highlighted it in yellow so it matched this dimension, is that enrolled members often experience dual roles, meaning that they often were called upon to be child welfare workers with people that they live in the same community with very closely. So high school friends, church members, people that they see every day in their community. And that was really challenging to have that dual role in a small rural community. Non-enrolled members face challenges in terms of bureaucracy, educating tribal council on the processes of social services and human services and child welfare. So that was some of the challenges they faced. But ultimately, we wanted to look at how relationships impact the work. So we wrote a little paragraph on that, but people used their experiences of geographical and tribal disconnect to imagine how a child would feel who was displaced. They adapted their language in terms of reference to connect to their client base. And there's a few others that you can read about in terms of our findings in the figure that I posted below. So that is all that we have for this week. I'm hopeful that this brief lecture will give you an understanding of what focus codes are, what memoing is, what diagramming looks like, how we develop a category with properties and dimensions, and hopefully that will be helpful with completing your analysis and working through the remainder of the course. Thank you very much. Have a great week. Bye.